Howdy folks, hope you've all had a great weekend. Now forget about it because it's Monday and welcome back to another episode of Mingles with Jingles. Yeah. So I'm going to have the Division 2 running in the background in today's episode for a couple of reasons. First, I need to have something running in the background. And secondly, I don't know if you remember we were talking in last week's episode about how Massive Entertainment had massively managed to screw up an update for the Division 2. An update that was so massively broken that it completely buggered the entire update delivery system, which made it a bit of a challenge for them to release an update to fix the damage caused by the previous update, because it had broken the update system, which they pretty much had to start all over again and rewrite from scratch. Well, apparently they've done that. Some compensation has been offered for the annoyance factor caused to all of their players, and I thought, you know what, I'll have another go with the Division 2, because it's one of those games. I mean, I haven't played it in, I don't know, 6 months, but it's just always there, it's always installed, and it's one of the few games that my friend Roy and I actually play together. It is definitely better if you're playing with friends. I mean, it's perfectly playable alone, but there's just nothing memorable about it. I mean, I do play it alone, although I haven't in a long time. And the reason why is because when you're playing The Division, and this is just like every other Ubisoft open world game, you're not really having fun. You're just busy, right? You're just doing things. And it's very, very good at keeping you fed with things to do, so that before you know it, you haven't really been having that much fun, but you have been occupied and 7 hours have gone by. And yet the next day, you never wake up thinking, all right, I must have another go of the Division 2. It just doesn't engender that kind of response. But once you do start playing, it's a bit like when you're on the summer holidays and you realise, oh, yeah, I'm back to school in 4 days, I still haven't done any of my homework. All right, fine. But once you get started, you just blast through it. Even though you're not really enjoying it, it's just something that you're doing. And in that respect, I mean, you have to hand it to Ubisoft. They've made an art form out of these kind of games, because none of them are particularly enjoyable. I mean, there are obvious exceptions. Yes, Assassin's Creed Odyssey, I'm looking at you here, and also I kind of guess Assassin's Creed Valhalla as well. Some of them are absolutely terrible. Far Cry 6 and what was that expansion for Far Cry 5? The one with the twins that was just comically bad from start to finish. I mean, they're so bad they're good. But the majority of these type of games are just like the Division 2. They're not especially bad, they're not especially good, they're competent, and they just keep you busy. So I thought, well, I'll have another go. They've just released a content patch that fixed all the game's problems. What's the worst that can happen? So, yeah, stick around to the end of the video to see how it all turned out. So, moving on swiftly. I was browsing the Salt Mines Discord server, and because we have a channel on there called Mingle with Jingles, where people can post questions for Mingles with Jingles, questions that sadly I have been neglecting of late, but I'm going to do better. Starting right now, Hotel Kilo Actual passed on this little tidbit of information. It's regarding a game, well, it's not actually, well, it will be a game, it's in development. It's called Workers and Resources, Soviet Republic. And I've actually played this. I mean, it was a very long time ago. It was a very, very early build. It was rough as all hell, but it had a lot of potential. The idea is that you're in a Soviet Republic, Cold War era, and you basically have to build a city. I mean, you know, as the genre would suggest, it's a city builder game, but with a special communist twist to it. It's being developed by a Slovakian development team. Independent developer, no marketing budget whatsoever. They're self-publishing on Steam, and they've run into a bit of a problem, which is actually kind of common with games that rely on the community to spread word of mouth when you don't have a marketing budget. But it's the kind of problem that usually only occurs after the game's been out in full release for about a year or so, and the developers have shifted their focus from, you know, trying to make a good game to just trying to make as much money as possible out of the game. And it's not just small independent developers who run into this kind of issue. The big boys can get caught out by it too. An example that many of you are probably very, very intimate with would be the World of Warships Community Contributor Program, for example. I mean, World of Warships did have a big marketing budget. You know, they had TV spots and all sorts of things, but they also enlisted the help of the community to push word of mouth around people like myself. And of course, the thing you have to remember is at the time, while it was in closed beta and then open beta and then initial release, World of Warships was one of the best games around because the developers were committed to making the best possible game they could. I know it seems hard to believe in this day and age, but there was absolutely a time when the World of Warships development team would bend over backwards to try to keep the community happy, to deliver the game that the players wanted. And of course, you know, there were very cynical reasons for this. It wasn't because they actually gave a shit about what the community thought. I mean, they did, but only in so much as they wanted to keep that good, positive word of mouth going around. Because when a game's in early development, the people that get on board are the people who are passionate about it. I'm talking about the community side here, not the developer side. And passionate fans, particularly passionate fans with YouTube channels, right, can generate a lot of goodwill and get a lot of feet in the door from players who would otherwise probably not have heard about or even been interested in the game. So this is why they're very, very keen to do whatever they can to keep the community happy in the early days. It's an extremely cheap and effective, it's basically a free way of getting a lot of people to install and play your game in that crucial early phase right after the game's release or leading up to the game's release, when the most important thing for the development team is to just get as many people as they possibly can playing the game and enjoying it and talking about how much they enjoy it. This is what I like to refer to as the honeymoon phase. You, the community, we, the community, are in love with the game. And we think the game's in love with us. It's certainly making all of the right signals. The sad truth of the matter is that we're all being taken for a ride because the game is nothing more than a dirty, manipulative, gold-digging whore. It's just waiting. It's just waiting for that moment. You know, when the player base is sufficiently big, it's waiting for that moment to reveal that we were being taken for a ride the whole time. The game doesn't care about us. It doesn't care what we think. It was just waiting until it didn't need us anymore. It's got a big enough player base that it's now self-sustaining. It no longer needs us to keep whispering sweet nothings in the ears of the world about how great the game is, and so it reveals its true nature. The developers stop trying to make the best game they possibly can, and they shift focus to just trying to make the most profitable game they possibly can. Now, the issue for the developers at this point, and this can be a tricky point to navigate, if they haven't gotten the numbers exactly right, they could find themselves in a lot of trouble, is because of those passionate and very vocal and influential early adopters. People who got into the game in the early days because they were passionate about it, they enjoyed playing it, they loved it, and they wanted to see it do well. And they had those YouTube audiences. Gee, it's almost as if I have some kind of personal experience with this whole sort of thing. Yes, those YouTube audiences that the developer found so valuable and attractive in the early days, but which the developer no longer needs, which is why they've stopped trying to make a good game and they're now just trying to make a profitable game. The problem is those early adopters, those passionate, vocal, influential early adopters, they're still there. They're still just as passionate, they're still just as vocal, and they're still just as influential. But now you're pissing them off because you revealed your true nature. You've stopped paying attention to them. You're spurning them. In some cases, you stop even pretending that you're paying attention to them because you simply just don't need them anymore. And if you've miscalculated the numbers, because it turns out you do actually still need them because your player base isn't quite there yet, this can backfire dramatically because those vocal, passionate early adopter fans are now your most vocal, passionate enemies. A year ago, they were telling everybody, you must play this game, it's amazing, because it was amazing. And now they're telling everybody, whatever you do, do not spend any money on this game. The development team stopped giving a shit a long time ago, and now all they're trying to do is make as much money as possible out of you. The thing is, under normal circumstances, and we're getting back to the Slovakian independent city builder game that we were talking about at the beginning of the video, Workers and Resources, the Soviet Republic, because that is actually what this story is about. under normal circumstances, to get to that point where you turn your most vocal and influential fans against you, it's usually at least a year after the game comes out. It generally doesn't happen while the game's still in development, which is what has happened to the poor Slovakian development team responsible for this communist Cold War era city builder game. And they haven't even done anything wrong. It's not even their fault, which is kind of unusual. You see, what's happened is this. This from the Kotaku gaming news website that's Hotel Kilo Actual linked to on the Salt Mines Discord server. Workers and Resources Soviet Republic is a city builder that has a particular focus on how urban planning worked alongside the communist economies of Eastern Europe during the Cold War. It's not for everyone, but it certainly has its fans. Sadly, those fans are now the only ones able to play the game because it's now unable to be purchased by anyone else after a DMCA takedown reportedly got the game removed from Steam's marketplace. In a post made by the game's developers, Slovakian Studio 3 Division, it's claimed that a player, once a respected member of the community, has gone rogue and begun attacking the game's online presence, trying to get everything from trailers to the game's entire website taken down. It is alleged that this player had written a guide on a way to play the game more realistically, and that while the developers had already been working on a game mode that did just that, they'd agreed to add him to the game's credits as a goodwill gesture given his prominence within the community. 3 Division say this player then, having been told they wouldn't be added to the credits until after this new mode had been completed and released, started to abuse the YouTube report system, issuing copyright strikes to one of our most helpful influencers. So, and I'm going to interject here, just so you understand exactly how spiteful this guy is. I mean, we're talking spite level over 9,000 here. After being told that he wouldn't get an in-game credit until after the thing that he had been talking about, which the developers had been working on anyway, was actually in the game, right? At that point, they would put his name in the credits as a goodwill gesture. Or in other words, because he wasn't already being credited for the thing that he actually had nothing to do with, and which wasn't even in the game yet, this guy went nuclear. There's no other way to describe it. And the really spiteful thing here is, initially, he didn't even start going after the game developers. He started going after other YouTubers who were simply doing videos about the game that they loved and were passionate about, and started getting their videos taken down with DMCA copyright strikes. 3 of those, you lose your channel forever. And to make matters worse, these are of course completely bogus bullshit DMCA copyright strikes in the first place, because I'm pretty sure he doesn't own the intellectual property to the idea of making a slightly more realistic communist-era city builder game, which is the basis for the copyright strikes that he's issuing, not against the developer, but against other people putting videos of the game up. He's basically saying, this was my idea, you stole it from me, even though you were working on a more realistic mode anyway, and because you're not giving me credit for something that wasn't really even my idea in the first place and which you haven't even put into the game yet, I'm going to start threatening the livelihood of other people on YouTube who are doing videos about it. So, unsurprisingly, once the developers heard that this dick was going after other YouTubers who were simply doing videos on the game, they withdrew their offer to officially thank him and put him in the credits. In response to this, this guy then reported the game's website and had it taken down, then began reporting other official YouTube videos from the studio as well. Matters have now escalated to the point where the game itself has been taken off Steam due to a DMCA copyright request, and the player is now claiming that they own the rights to this new realistic game mode, you know, the one that isn't even in the game yet. Now here's the thing. If you get stuff taken down with a DMCA copyright strike, you get the opportunity to appeal. Unfortunately, the system is heavily weighted in favour of the person who issued the claim in the first place. If you're defending against the claim, you are basically guilty until proven innocent. And if the person or entity who filed the claim in the first place refuses to relinquish it after you dispute it, the only option for you is to take them to court. And that shit is expensive. And this is a small, independent Slovakian games developer. They just don't have the money for that. Neither, of course, do the other innocent bystanders caught in the crossfire, the other YouTubers who've suffered copyright strikes simply because they did videos on the game. But hang on, Jingles, this cuts both ways. If the whole thing ends up in court, the person who filed the claims is also going to have a very, very expensive time. Normally, yes, that would be the case. But not in this case, because apparently the person who's been filing all of these copyright claims is a lawyer. So the only thing it's going to cost him is his time. So it's basically a win-win situation for this colossal dick filing all of these copyright claims, because one of two things is going to happen. Either nobody can afford to take him to court, so he wins, or he does get taken to court by the developers, and the developers will probably win because this guy absolutely definitely does not own the intellectual property rights to the idea of making a slightly more realistic Cold War era city building game. But he still wins because it'll bankrupt the development team because they don't have the money for that kind of shit, and all it costs him is his time. A couple of days in court. Big deal. So because of the way the copyright system is set up, whether he wins or loses, he still wins. Because either his claims are upheld because nobody can afford to take him to court, and he ruins a game and an independent development team, or they do take him to court and he loses, and he still ruins a game and an independent development team because they can't afford to take him to court, and they wouldn't have any money to continue developing the game if they did. So it's a win-win situation for the arsehole, and it's a lose-lose situation for the game developers and anybody who was having fun playing their game. And remember, this whole thing happened because some dick with way too much free time on their hands, who wasn't actually involved in the development of the game at all, happened to have an idea that the developers were working on anyway, as a result of which, and because he'd been quite a passionate supporter of the game while it was in alpha, and to acknowledge the fact that yes, it was a cool idea. I mean, we were working on it anyway, but you know, we'll give you a credit, but we won't put the credit into the game until we've actually implemented the thing that you were talking about, which we were working on anyway. And because he didn't get his credit right now, God damn it, he went to DEF CON 1, and now everybody has to pay for it. This has to be the most ultimate act of spite I've heard about this year. In fact, in several years. This one just beggars description, even though I've, spent a good 17 minutes now trying to describe it. By the way, if this episode of Mingles with Jingles suddenly mysteriously disappears in a couple of days, it's probably because I've been talking about this subject and somebody has decided to issue me with the DMCA copyright takedown. Well, anyway, moving on swiftly. I wanted to talk about unintended design consequences, and this is going to start off gaming related, but it's going to have real world implications as well. So the thing that got me thinking about this was in World of Warcraft. Back in the days of the Burning Crusade expansion, Holy Paladins, a healing class, basically became a one-button healer. And what I mean by that is they had a whole bunch of different healing spells, but the only one they would ever use, and I'm kind of generalizing a bit here, but it's basically true, the only one healing spell they would ever use was their Flash of Light heal. Now, the Flash of Light is a very, very fast casting, but very expensive for the amount of health that it replenishes, healing spell. So it doesn't heal for a huge amount, but you can cast it very quickly. So if somebody needs a heal right now, that's the one to go for. The thing is, it became the only real healing spell that Holy Paladins used because of a number of factors. First, all of the critical strike rating that was on Holy Paladin plate armor. And Holy Paladin talents allowed them to get the mana cost back, or at least partial mana cost back for any heal that critted. Which meant that if you stacked as much critical strike rating as possible, your Flash of Light spell was basically guaranteed to crit, and of course when it critted it healed for twice as much, so it suddenly became actually a fairly efficient heal, as well as being a very, very fast heal, and it became even more efficient because when it critted you got something like 60% of the mana cost back, which basically meant that Holy Paladins were a one-button healing class. They just spammed Flash of Light on anything that needed healing, and it made them kind of really boring and easy to play. The thing is, it had been designed that way. This was actually an intended design consequence. But Blizzard realised, actually, this is kind of bad. Well, what's the point in giving them all these healing spells if this is the only one that they use? So in the next tier of raid content, they started taking critical strike rating off Holy Paladin plate armor. So this would force the Holy Paladins to use spells other than Flash of Light, yes? I mean, it seems logical if you don't look too hard at it. Holy Paladins are only spamming Flash of Light and nothing else because of all of the crit rating on Holy Paladin plate armor. Okay, so if you take the crit rating off Holy Paladin plate armor, they'll have to start using other healing spells. Seems perfectly logical. And it is perfectly logical. If the problem is that there's too much crit rating on Holy Paladin plate armor. But that was not the problem. The problem was the talent that gave Holy Paladins 60% of their mana back if they got a critical heal while spamming the Flash of Light healing spell. That didn't change. Flash of Light was still always going to be the single most efficient heal that a Holy Paladin could cast if they had a lot of crit rating. So what actually happened was that since there wasn't any crit rating on Holy Paladin plate armor anymore, they stopped bidding for and rolling on Holy Paladin plate armor. They just wanted gear that had intellect in order to give them mana to cast their spells and lots of crit rating. So they suddenly started rolling for and bidding on Elemental and Restoration Shaman chainmail armor, Balance and Restoration Druid leather armor, and all of the cloth armor that was the only armor option available to all of the priests, mages, and warlocks. I mean, priests, mages, and warlocks have always had the shitty end of the stick when it comes to loot allocation in World of Warcraft, because anybody can equip cloth armor, right? Priests, mages, and warlocks can only equip cloth armor. And up until this point, they'd been getting all bitter and twisted, and justifiably so, because a lot of the stuff that was the only stuff they could equip was also best in slot for any spellcasters who happened to use leather and chainmail. And now it was all best in slot for all the Holy Paladins as well, so it was even worse. This was an unintended game design consequence. The problem wasn't that there was too much crit rating on Paladin plate armor, it was the talent that gave Paladins back all of that mana when they got a critical heal. So yeah, sometimes the most obvious solution is not the best solution, or even a solution at all. Sometimes it just creates more problems than it fixes. And this, of course, also has real-world implications outside of gaming. Whenever you phone a call center, for whatever reason, maybe you've got a problem with an Amazon delivery, you've been waiting 3 months for something that is supposed to have been dispatched, and you're clearly being scammed. It's one of these fly-by-night fake companies that put a bunch of stuff up for sale on Amazon that they don't actually have and they never intend to actually sell. They just take your money and then they disappear. So you call Amazon to try to resolve the issue, or you need to talk to somebody at your bank, for example. All of these call centers are what are known as pickup targets. It's to avoid the situation where you end up spending 5 minutes sitting there with the phone ringing before somebody picks up and talks to you. So it's a noble goal in theory. It's there to provide a better service to you, the customer. They don't want you wasting your time listening to a phone ringing. So somebody somewhere designed a system where your call gets picked up immediately. So they meet all of their call pickup targets. But then you spend 15 to 30 minutes of your life going through options and listening to elevator music before you actually get to talk to somebody. And what generally tends to happen then is, because they also have other targets that they have to meet, a certain length of time that can go by before you actually get to talk to somebody, that first person that you get to talk to, all they do is put you on hold for another 30 minutes while they transfer you to somebody who can actually deal with your problem. But you've spoken to a real person, so the box has been ticked. That's all they really care about. It sounds like they want to provide a good service to you, the customer, but they don't. They're just ticking boxes so that they can report to their shareholders and the world at large that they're meeting all of their customer call service center targets, so that they can look good without actually providing any kind of meaningful service. Okay, maybe that's not such a great example, because that is actually the intended design consequence. It's just the one that they don't want you to know about. All right, how about this? Here in the UK, the National Health Service had a problem. Well, it didn't actually have a problem. I'll explain why in a moment. But the perceived problem, as far as the government were concerned, was that people were spending far too long sitting in accident and emergency rooms. This is the British version of the ER. spending far too long sitting in these accident and emergency rooms before getting treated. The reason that was happening, well, there were a number of reasons. First, the National Health Service was underfunded and they couldn't afford to hire enough staff to treat people promptly and efficiently, and as a result of which they were using a triage system, or triage. I'm never sure how that's pronounced. Anyway, the basic idea was, and this is what medics do everywhere, by the way, I mean, the NHS isn't special, they would prioritise the order of treatment. So if you walked in with a hamster up your arse or a saucepan on your head, you probably weren't going to die anytime soon, although it was probably bad news for the hamster. But if you walked in, or were carried in, with a stab wound in your chest, you were going to get treated first, because if they didn't, you would probably die. Seems perfectly logical and reasonable, and it is perfectly logical and reasonable, but the government didn't like it, because all of those people with hamsters up their arses and saucepans on their head were sitting around waiting for 6 to 8 hours before an overworked nurse or doctor could attend to them. So in order to fix this problem, what the government should probably have done was pay for more doctors and nurses. But instead they introduced a target system that stated that 95% of anybody admitted to an accident and emergency room must be treated within 4 hours, or the National Health Service would start getting penalised. So what do you think happened? Did the National Health Service just magic up a whole bunch of fresh doctors and nurses out of its arse in order to cope with these completely unrealistic targets? Or did they start gaming the system in order to avoid being penalised? They started gaming the system, which meant that in extreme cases, what could happen is you would be left to bleed because the guy sitting over there with the saucepan on his head had been sitting there for 3 hours and 40 minutes, and if you didn't get that saucepan off his head in the next 20 minutes, you were going to have to pay for it. Oh, and the division just crashed. I managed to get through an entire 26 minutes and 40 seconds, some of which were loading screens of my freshly patched and honestly working fine now, we promise, Division 2 before it keeled over and died on me. Oh well, back again in another 6 months, I guess. See what's changed. Probably not an awful lot. And on that bombshell, that's it for this week's episode of Mingles with Jingles. Hope you've enjoyed it. Hope you've all had a great weekend. And as always, take care. And I'll catch you next time.